Hello, everybody, and welcome to a conversation about coping. My name is Mike Hess. I am Senior Director of Public Outreach and Education for the COPD Foundation, and it is my honor today to be joined by Gabrielle Davis, who I've known for a few years now. Gabrielle is a lot of things. She's a master of public health. She's a licensed professional counselor. She's a respiratory therapist. She's a certified health education specialist and a certified tobacco cessation specialist. So we are honored to have her today and very excited to get into the conversation about coping. So Gabrielle, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So let's jump into it from maybe an RT's perspective. First of all, happy Respiratory Care Week.
Likewise, right back at you.
Thank you. Now, going from a respiratory therapist to a licensed counselor is a somewhat unique career path. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I do want to say I've never not been an RT. So I've taken RT into counseling and counseling, back into RT. When I decided to go to be a therapist, it was out of spite. I mean, to be a counselor, it was out of spite, right? And it was for a couple reasons. I lived in a town where I couldn't find a therapist that looked like me. And I had experiences, with therapists that did look like me, but I was looking for help around some things that were going on in the town. The town I lived in was Idaho. So it's not a very diverse place. And I struggled for 3 years to find a therapist. And it made me mad. Other reasons, I also was a facilitator for a youth group and they also had trouble finding a therapist. But one of the biggest reasons, and this is where the RT portion came in, I've always worked and been passionate about folks with nicotine addiction. And I always heard these stories about, and even with my mom who has COPD and nicotine addiction, about the fact that we don't put pressure on healthcare industry to provide assistance to folks with nicotine addiction as we would do other substances, right? Even though we know that nicotine is one of the most addictive substances to begin with, even in relation to heroin and alcoholism. It's hard to quit. And so we didn't see a lot of that from the healthcare world on commercials. There's more commercials about AA than Nicotine Anonymous, which exists too. And then the final part, in my last job, up until March, I worked as the coordinator for a COPD program. And I would see things written, in the chart that bothered me. Things like patient is non-compliant with medications, or patient does this. A lot of blame from healthcare workers. And that also pissed me off because nobody dug deeper to see the reason why that was happening. Why are we calling it compliance? We've also done something. We as in healthcare workers have done something to assist them with not adhering. Did we not give them all the things they need? Do we not empower them? And so it's all of that, right? So now in my practice, I have people I see living with lung disease that come in for depression and anxiety, or I talk to a lot of people for the same reason, and it has went up significantly since COVID.
I can only imagine. We know that we've had a lot of people struggling with anxiety and depression. I think as a society, we were kind of trending that way anyway beforehand. Mm-hmm. And COVID, as with many things in healthcare, kind of shone a light on a lot of the issues that were already existing. And, we kind of wanted to look at it as, well, COVID caused all these kinds of things. But it was really more that it started highlighting some of the inequities and loss of access and pre-existing failures of access. So there's a lot that I want to unpack just right already in that 5 minutes. One of the things you said was the importance of being able to talk to somebody that looks like you, that has kind of been on that same path. And that really connected with me because yesterday I still keep a toe in some of the COPD Facebook groups. Mm-hmm. And there was a discussion started by a longtime member of one group that I ran for a while, still kind of run. That was talking about how it's really difficult to get people who don't have COPD and who don't use oxygen and who aren't dealing with that sort of thing to get it. It's hard for them to
Mhm.
get it. Is that something you see people dealing with a lot in your experience?
Absolutely. I also saw that parts of that conversation that you're speaking about. Yeah, it's a lot. And even me, like, growing up, with my mom as a teenager. Now I'm a teenager and we still have people doing these things as adults. My idea of helping my mom quit smoking was throwing her cigarettes out the window. Strategically right before my father came home. So then he would roll over and then we would both be in trouble, right? But I understand addiction, right? And so now my mom, she's 68 with COPD, and to see the way I used to talk to her or care for her prior to just having more understanding about the disease and how it's different for everybody was a lot different. Like, we have caregivers, parents, partners, children approaching somebody living with lung disease and saying, "Oh, just do this, oh, just do that," and they haven't experienced the same way. And I keep going back to nicotine because they coexist in a lot of spaces. Just like when somebody smokes, you say, "Oh, just quit." Well, if that person was on heroin, you wouldn't say, "Oh, just quit." You was like, "Let me get you some help." And so it is. You do need somebody that not all the time that can get you, that can understand you, either because they believe you without judging or without arguing, or they've been through it. Support can look like different things. Support for somebody with lung disease, when they tell you, like, "Man, I'm really struggling with that," you can say things like, "That sucks," because it does. You don't have to say, like, "Oh, it'll get better," and things like that. You don't know that. You don't know those things. You can encourage folks, but if they are feeling down, it's okay. Feeling sad is a feeling. We are allowed to have those things. Being angry, that's an emotion. We are allowed to have those things. And as a person without lung disease currently, right? All you can do is say, "How can I best support you?" Versus, "Oh, I know how that is." You don't. And then try to compare something else like, "Well, I have flatulence and I was uncomfortable too." It's not the same. Those are different things. No.
So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on a thing. You're talking about first of all, you were talking about talking to people,
Hmm.
and I think that really tied in with one of the first things you said, where we talk about compliance. Historically, we've kind of had this very authoritarian, patriarchal, whatever, hierarchical healthcare system where we've got the clinicians, usually the doctor, right at the top, kind of telling everybody what to do. Whereas now it seems we're trying to get into that more of that collaborative approach and going from compliance to adherence.
Hmm.
What do you think is behind that change?
Push. And honestly, I think it's the newer generation, like younger folks saying these things out loud because, society told older generations that you can't question a physician. You can't question a provider. And now it's shared governance is the way. When you have input from the person suffering, that's when adherence happens. You know, I couldn't tell my mother what to do if I tried. She might have this same exact idea that I had, but it's better if she says it. It's always better to have buy-in from other people. Let me just give you a quick example somewhere. About this was pre-COVID, so in 2019, I had a person in the hospital who I hadn't seen in a long time. She was a person living with COPD. When I first met her, I used to go to her room all the time. I used to take games and play with, folks in the hospital who didn't get a lot of visitors. And we would talk and chat, during my free time. And we would sit together and talk. I met her daughter when her daughter would visit, and we had a good time when we were in there. I hadn't seen her for a while. We all know that the hospitals don't want folks to come back within 30 days, and so you do what you can do to help folks be successful outside the hospital. I hadn't seen her for a while, and I was excited that I hadn't seen her. About 6 months after the last visit, she came back in, and so I go in. I take my deck of cards. We're playing goldfish, and we're chit chatting. And she's talking about her daughter's husband. She's like, "Oh yeah, he has to bring me my meds now, and and all these things that he doesn't know. She's man bashing, so she's in there man bashing, and I'm just listening. And I said, well, how come your daughter isn't bringing, your medicine anymore? She was like, well, she broke her femur, and so she's been on bed rest for the last 45 days. So she's in the hospital for, COPD exacerbation. And the reason is because she didn't have access to her inhalers, right? In the chart, it said she was non-compliant because they asked her if she took her medicine, and she said no. Nobody dug in deeper to see that the person that was bringing her medicines was immobile, And so in that moment, people are reading the charts like, oh, this person is, they judge. We judge people based on what we think we know. We don't ask more questions. And the thing that helped this woman was we changed her prescription to a mail order. And that was it. But how many days went past, when we weren't listening, listening to the person in the bed, and we're just making our judgments for ourselves. So including people in their care is absolutely paramount. Asking more questions, going beyond the bare minimum. As a healthcare professional, and people were taught that disease manifests in the same way for everybody, but that's absolutely not true. You went to respiratory school just like I did, in a lot of the books. You say, this is when the person has pulmonary fibrosis, this is how you treat it. Or a person has COPD, that's not a thing. They are the experts on their lives. And they need to have, input on whatever the plan is. They need to be able to ask questions, and we need to deliver it in a way that they understand the best way they learn versus the only way we got. So I'm happy to see shared governments. I love to see folks arguing with their clinician about things they read, and just being more involved in their care. I love it. I love seeing it. I'm happy it's happening.
So how do we as clinicians promote that? You mentioned that a lot of the things that are driving the shared governance and all that are coming from younger generations. How do we help people who have maybe grown up being told that you don't question the doctor, you do what you're told, all that kind of stuff? How do we give those folks the tools that they need to come to the table for their own care?
Yeah. Right. So as a people, I say we have to model it. And so I'm going back to my mom again. Like, she knows I have no problem finding a new provider if we don't work well together. I'm not a physician, and I don't know everything, but I want to be heard. If anything, can I at least find somebody that would pretend well, right? And so we need to talk about this out loud. Like, it's okay to question your physician. It's okay to ask more questions. It's okay to go to, talk to a clinician with a notepad. Sorry, they decided to cut down a tree right before I got on here, just randomly. But, empowering people and modeling that thing, also. As clinicians, while we're in the room with folks, we can ask them, what other questions do you have? And even more, going further than that, I'll come back. Think about any questions you have, and I'll come back to answer them. Because oftentimes we force people to think on the fly, which isn't something that a lot of older folks can do. Everybody processes different. Like, I have to think for a minute before I have questions about certain things. They need to know that it's okay to ask questions. The last thing I'll say to add to that is answering I don't know to folks when you truly don't know, instead of making something up, which we are horrible at. When I say we, again, I mean healthcare professionals.
Absolutely.
It's okay to say I don't know. Like, it's absolutely okay. There's many times I've gone in a room, while I was working with people with lung disease, and they asked me a question. I'm like, that's a good question. Let me find out. Or let's find out together. But showing them that they can be actively involved, right?
Great.
Those are the best things I can think of right now, anyway.
So on the lines of asking questions, I do want to point out to everybody that we are in fact live right now, and I can verify that because we've already gone about 5 degrees off of the stuff that Gabby and I were going to talk about. But that also means that everybody out there can ask us some questions. We've seen some good conversation already popping up in the chat. Phyllis is saying, thank you, Gabrielle, for coming to speak with us. Hello to Valerie. Rosalind Schneider says, thank you for all you do. Chris says, thanks for being here. We got a lot of folks who are interested. This is certainly the time for you to ask questions about coping, different techniques, and all that sort of thing, because while we do have kind of an idea of some of the things we want to talk about, and, as a couple of RTs, we can go around and round all afternoon. This is really an opportunity for you folks. So while we're waiting for some more questions to come in, I am a little bit curious. We talk, again, going back to the idea of the shared experience, the common ground, all that sort of thing. Obviously, there aren't a lot of RTs who have COPD. There are a few. And there are a few that are walking the path of tobacco cessation, and so can very directly speak to that. I am not one of those people. Prior to coming to the foundation, I worked in primary care, and I also did a lot of tobacco cessation. And so I want to get your thoughts about my strategy. I like your idea of looking at it as an addiction, as not just a, whoops, see, we're live, a habit that you can break. I struggled with weight my whole life. And on a similar note to people telling smokers that they should just stop, they should just quit, it's easy, just don't buy anymore, all that stuff. I had clinicians telling me a lot to just eat less, just move more, just put the fork down, push away from the table. And, of course, as somebody struggling with weight, I know that's the thing to do, just like I think a lot of the smoking population knows that they should quit. And so when we just keep kind of hitting them over the head with that, it becomes kind of counterproductive. So I wondered, as a professional, this is just kind of my amateur trying to find common ground. What would be your professional opinion on RTs and other tobacco cessation people just trying to find a similar experience in their background to try to make that connection in that relationship?
That's a good question. This is one that comes up all the time because I've also have not struggled with nicotine addiction, but similar to you, weight has always been an issue, right? So for instance, I'll give you a scenario. I walk into the room. Hey, Mike, I'm Gabby. I'm here to talk to you about nicotine addiction or whatever I use, depending on the person in the bed. And a lot of times I would get like, did you smoke? I was like, no, I didn't, but I understand addiction, and a lot of times that might be the first time they've heard that. That's a very, common question. It's also something I would ask. It's very hard. It was very hard to me to go to a trainer who has never experienced being a fat person, because, and I'm like, how do you know? Like, how do you know how hard this is? What about my knees? My ankles hurt. Like, can we switch these movements around? But just throwing it out there and just killing the elephant in the room, right there. I said, I don't understand how you feel because I haven't experienced it, but I have had my own personal addictions. And so self-disclosure, which is also not a thing, that's taught and it's usually frowned upon to bring in parts of you into any interaction with a person in the hospital, or for me, a person in session, but it's something that works because the people across from you are people before they're patients. So it's important to incorporate some of those things. I also acknowledge that, like, no, I'm not, but are there things I can help you with? What is something you want to share with me about it, right? The biggest thing is, and when we talk about nicotine addiction, I'm trying not to go on the soapbox. Nicotine addiction is a disease and not a choice. Nobody chooses, like, you know what? I want to buy a pack of cigarettes every day for the rest of my life. Nobody's making that choice. It's an addiction, just like heroin, just like methamphetamine, just like another legal substance, just like alcohol. So these are all addictions that there, is help for. And as healthcare professionals, again, we have to acknowledge that. The program I worked with in Idaho, when I first got to it, it was called something else. It was called tobacco treatment something. And so we changed the wording around nicotine because nicotine is viewed differently by different populations, just so to be more inclusive of different interfaces, vaping, chewing, hookah, all of those things. Because a lot of people associated tobacco with cigarettes. So we wanted people to know more. I inherited a team of people when I started there, and how I weeded out folks is I asked them in our first meeting, who here believes nicotine addiction is a choice? Whoever raised their hands, kicked them off the team. And then I had my core group of team. I'm a core group of folks to work with. Then I added students and RTs that weren't as seasoned, because this involves you talking and building rapport with the patient, which oftentimes they do a lot better with because they are not disengaged with the profession. Like some, we have a few seasoned RTs that are kind of over it, right, and are moving towards retirement, and then you have these newer RTs that are fresh and ready to go, and we got them on the team just to go in the room and sit down with the person and have an honest conversation. If you are a person that hasn't used, you should absolutely just say you haven't used before. Be honest. Never say like, I don't use, but my mom smoked. That's not the same thing. Or, well, I grew up with a smoker, so I had to deal with it. And finally, the last thing you can do is just say, yeah, you just really need to stop. If there's an order, if you're at a hospital, you see an order that says tobacco cessation, which is what they still say oftentimes, unless somebody battles to get that changed, because we should be focusing on treatment. If they get to cessation, that's great, but we need to treat them wherever they are and however they want to be, receive treatment. When you go in just saying like, hey, you really should stop, that's not providing a service. That's harmful to somebody already experiencing lung disease. Like if you're at a hospital, they're in the hospital. Something has already happened, regardless if it was because of nicotine addiction or not. We don't want to add any stress, guilt, or fear to what is already happening. Right? So it's a dance.
Again, important for people who are experiencing that to stand up and say, hey, I'm already feeling bad enough about being here, all that sort of thing. Chris also rings in with the idea, liking the idea of they are people before patients. That's really resonating. Mm-hmm. I do want to touch on, Tara asked the question. And again, this kind of goes back into when you're building your team. Tara asks, do you find that ex-smokers might be able to relate more to patients who are trying to quit compared to non-smokers? So, again, setting aside what we were just talking about finding the common ground or anything like that, did you ever notice with any of your team members that people who had successfully quit just got it a little bit more, or was it a little bit easier, or was able to connect a little bit better? Is this a thing that can be taught?
No, I think absolutely having folks that were addicted before should absolutely be on your team, because they can talk about the struggle they went through. I can't talk about my struggle with nicotine addiction because I haven't experienced it. So having people who used to use nicotine, whatever it was, on your team is absolutely paramount to a success of a team. I wish I had a few people on my team that did use, and there were that previously used, and there were folks on my team who did, but they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't feel safe enough because, again, you're RT that use nicotine. Sometimes you're judged because of that. But I think having ex-users on the team is absolutely paramount to success. And patients do connect with them. They really do. And I've gotten requests like, can you send somebody who used to use? I said, oh, absolutely. The problem that comes with that sometimes is there are a lot of folks who believe that the best way to quit is cold turkey. And we've read the same research. Only about 4% of people who quit cold turkey remain nicotine free after 6 months. So it's important that even if that's their journey, yes, say like, yeah, I quit cold turkey, but never, make it a jovial comment like, yeah, I just put it down and that was it. That's when the problem comes in, because most people, it's over a dozen times that they've tried. So you don't always want to hear somebody come in. It's like, yeah, it was no big deal. I just quit and put it down. That was it.
Yeah, I would always tell people it's enough that everybody knows somebody, but it's not enough that it's actually a practical way to go, a practical strategy. So we do have a question from Samantha, which was actually something we did want to talk about even beforehand. Samantha asks, what about coping with addiction during COVID when people are trying to quit or isolated? And I know that isolation was a theme that we touched on it very briefly at the beginning, and that was something we really wanted to hit on because, as Samantha also mentioned, connection to resources like Better Breathers Clubs and pulmonary rehab and all that sort of thing have been very limited over the last 18 months. So what are your thoughts on trying to do these kind of therapies in the setting of COVID still.
Yeah, that's a big one too. So in my practice, I provide virtual therapy, and when I got busy, it was because of that. So having less visits from people, and also being able to visit less with pulmonary rehab, right? So it's getting started, being excited about something and they take it away, you know. And then virtual doesn't work for everybody, so we have to think outside the box. So one of the ways is accessing therapy via telehealth. There are many programs depending on your insurance, or if you have insurance, and there are other free programs offered by most states, but there's work to do to find those, right? And so that's when it becomes important to get involved, and even some of the national directories, and just doing simple Google searches to find where you can be with other people so you can access those services. But if you are a person that lives alone, it becomes a little harder. If you are not a person who's good with technology, it becomes a little harder. And so still outside sources are super helpful, whether that's a book service or what you can get by mail order. If you are suffering from isolation, it's likely that addiction continuance or recovery without any relapses will be harder, right? Because the things you did to fill your time or to change your environment or your behavior, which is what is necessary to continue with cessation of any substance, has been inhibited by the disease. This is those indirect impacts of COVID that we talked about before. Like, yes, COVID has, killed thousands and thousands of people, but what about the people that's impacted indirectly? And this is one of the things. There are free coping mechanisms, so you can center yourself. And I can share some links. Mike, I'll share some links and I'll post it in this chat afterwards that
Great.
folks can go to, that they can do themselves without the help of anybody else. The COPD Foundation has, even though this is not specifically for addiction, but there are videos on the COPD Pocket Consultant app of different exercises you can do in a moment. And a lot of people I've worked with, even people without lung disease, have been helpful using those for addiction during COVID, just so they can have something else to do, and feel like somebody is teaching them something or things like that. But absolutely using, other resources. The thing with environment, you have to change it around. So, for instance, my mother, again, is 68 years old. She's blind. She has COPD. She lives about 30 minutes away from me. When COVID first happened, I lived in a different state, right? My sister couldn't visit as often because she worked in a hospital. And so, which means she was at risk for COVID, which means she couldn't see my mother. This is when we first knew about COVID. My brother couldn't visit as much because he had COVID. He also had a job. I couldn't visit as much because I was in another state. During that time, because of those different things, she was on oxygen from a previous exacerbation, PRN, and she had the oxygen on, forgot, lit a cigarette, and lit her face on fire,
Oh,
right? Because we know oxygen is flammable. But that came from boredom. That came from isolation. So while we're talking about nicotine addiction, these are the indirect impacts of that if you don't keep yourself busy in a certain way and whatever you deem as safe, or try something new during that time. So COPD Foundation, again, has tons of resources. American Lung Association has tons of resources around that too. And I'm happy to share some of my favorite ones. I'll share it in this chat after this event.
great. We would certainly appreciate that. And as Gabby mentioned, the Pocket Consultant app, a free app that's available through Android and iOS. Go to your app store of choice and download it today. So I want to thank Sharon for sharing her tobacco cessation story in the chat, but I want to step away from that a little bit and dive a little bit deeper into the idea of isolation. We know that COPD can be kind of an isolating disease to begin with, simply because there are a lot of planning and logistical stuff, and sometimes you just, if anybody's ever heard of spoon theory, sometimes you just don't have enough spoons to get around. Or the new meme is Noodles the pug. If it's a Bones Day or a No Bones Day, you can check that out on Twitter. It's a new viral thing that's been traveling around the foundation a little bit. So how has the impact of COVID changed the level of isolation? Is it still the same? Has it changed people's ability to deal with it? Again, from your perspective as a counselor, how has COVID impacted isolation? And what are some other ways that people can deal with isolation in general, just outside of accessing services and things like that?
Yeah. So yes, isolation is absolutely increased, and so is anxiety and depression, right? And a lot of those things are just not just simple sadness. It's the grieving process of change and loss. So oftentimes when we talk about grieving, we're talking about the death of someone, right? However, grief encompasses change as well. So things that are changing is not knowing. You don't know what's going to happen. Will you be able to go to that doctor's office, or will they close down because they, something happening? We don't want to create any aerosol. Like, we don't know that. Is pulmonary rehab open this week? Should I plan for that? Do I need to get my ride in order? Oh no, it's closed. I found out the day of. Like, those are things too, like the constant change and never knowing what's happening and having no control. So the loss of control. That's also what happens to folks when they're in the hospital. That you come in and the first thing you sign away is the control over things you have. So it's the same thing that's just happening in a more comfortable space. If you don't want to access services, or you can't access services from home, one of the things you can do is get involved in nature around your house, not looking at the same four walls. As a therapist, the space you see behind me is the office I see clients in when I'm providing therapy. However, for me as well, as someone in a mental health space, I try to go outside and do sessions too, and constantly change my environment. Because just like addiction, if it looks like a place where you're sad at all the time, it'll be a place that you're sad in all the time, right? So constantly change your environment. If you watch TV and you sit on one side of the couch doing something simple as sitting on the other side of the couch, switch up whatever your routine is. The other thing that's really simple to do is journaling. Now, for a lot of folks, that is not an option. Some folks may think it's boring or that won't help, but getting out how you feel on paper really feels good. Even if what you're getting out is sadness or feelings of despair, you've shared them with the universe. Nobody may know, but you can also look back on that when you're feeling better. Like, man, look at the growth I've had since this day. Look at what happened then and what is happening now. Journal prompts are available everywhere. I'm happy to also share some journal prompts afterwards, but journaling can be an absolute space saver and sometimes a lifesaver when it comes to isolation. The last thing that I want to share, and it's about writing too, and some folks may think it's old or archaic, writing letters to folks, whether it's a pen pal or a friend or a relative. That is something you can do to add routine to your day. So you have something like, okay, today is Tuesday, I'm gonna write a letter to this person. You have to set up things for you to look forward to.
And on a similar note, if people aren't necessarily comfortable with writing, I've seen there's at least one RT out there who's been sharing some of their artwork that they've been using to cope with the stress and the anxiety and everything else that's been going in with treating COVID. And so I think that could be another outlet for a lot of folks.
Yeah, voice recordings too. I have folks in session now that will, record something. Maybe it's on their phone, or I have one person that actually uses a voice recorder and records themselves with the little cassette tapes thing. I'm like, where did you get that from? And does that too, just to let it out. Whatever you can find. I also do something with my clients called wellness plans. And so what that looks like is you can have different topics. It looks different for everybody. But hey, when I'm feeling like this, I'm going to do this. If I feel really sad this day, I'm going to go in the kitchen and rearrange the magnets on my fridge. So you counteracting a feeling with something that you can do to feel good. I have a wellness plan too. When different things happen and I feel a certain way, I'm like, okay, I need to do this, or I need to put my phone down, or I need a day without screens, right? It looks different for everybody. And please know that you don't have to do everything that everybody else is doing. No one has to agree with you. If it's safe for you, it's safe for you.
So it seems like Sharon kind of agrees with this whole idea. She is saying that she knows she will exercise better when we get to pulmonary rehab and that sort of thing, back in group therapy rather than alone. And so I think a lot of people are in that boat, and it's great to be able to have those options as soon as we can. Also, I wanted to go back a little bit. Karen was checking in, was saying that she was really sorry that your mom had that experience, and was wondering if she
Mm-hmm.
had fully recovered.
Yeah, she's great. She's back. She's feisty. Knows everything. Is back controlling all of her kids. Yeah, she. This was during COVID, so of course she want to go to the hospital because still COVID is more scary than having your face burnt up. For a lot of people. But yeah, she's great. She doesn't use oxygen at all. Yeah, she's great. Thank you for asking.
Well, it's good to hear. So Louise has a really good question. How do you deal with someone who is still afraid to leave her house? She'll only go for a ride in the car by herself just to drive around. She has everything else she needs delivered. Other than talking on the phone, how can someone like that be helped?
Mhm. Well, first thing you have to validate how they feel, which is really hard because the assumption is that everybody needs people to be around them regularly, and that's not true for somebody. Her way of coping may be isolation. Some people isolate on purpose because it's a scary time. There are a lot of unknowns around, COVID overall, and even before COVID was there. So validating them, like, hey, I understand you want to be alone. Is there a way I can support you? When in doubt, that question is always what you should do. A lot of times when we attempt to help people, first of all, it's amazing that you attempt to help somebody, but the way we want to help may not be the way they need to be helped. We have to do what they need, not what we want to do. So it's scary, but validation of what they're going through and how they want to help themselves is the way to go. If the something that you might be worried about is self-harm, that's a different story. You should absolutely call, someone for that. Um, every state usually has a mental health crisis line. I often shy away from calling police. I'd rather call somebody equipped with um, helping folks with mental health woes or mental health conditions versus the police because they can cause more harm by just being there. But every state has lines you can call. The suicide hotlines are also crisis lines. So it doesn't just have to be a thing of suicide. It could just be something you feel in crisis or someone else is in crisis. And so you can call them too. But just validate that person. Like, I understand you want to be alone. Please let me know if there is a way I can, support you. And just check in on them.
So that seems like it can also be tied in with anxiety and depression. We've talked about isolation kind of leading to some of these things, grief kind of leading to some of
Mm-hmm.
these things. What what would you offer as maybe like some frontline or even some second line therapies for somebody who is really struggling with a lot of these things? Anxiety about whether pulmonary rehab is going to be open or if they're going to be able to see kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews. What are some? Can you walk us through the process a little bit of how you would figure out a wellness plan, a treatment
Mm-hmm.
plan for these folks?
Right. And so, similar to what I said about including people and decisions that are made and treatments and things in the hospital, same thing goes for mental health care. So, oftentimes, when I'm in a space with someone for therapy sessions, we talk about what does treatment look like. And again, it's not a one size fits all. It's what works best for you. So just like you, when I talked about journal prompts, you're like, hey, some people, may want to do something else that doesn't write. The same concepts happen. You right, and so we have to include the person. One-on-one therapy is really great because it's two people. It's you and the therapist. The reason a therapist is important because you have an unbiased person that only knows what you bring to them. I have no outside impact or views of what is going on. The second thing is to validate that anxiety and or depression is a real thing, affecting a lot of people, whether they say it or not, or whether they know the name of what it is. Again, there are many ways to find a therapist and online or through your physician or through healthcare providers. When it comes to the treatment plan, that doesn't usually happen on the first session because I can't judge somebody after 45 minutes. Now, there are therapists that will do that. And if you use insurance, it's required. But for me, that's not ethical. And so after, a few conversations and me getting to know that person and them trusting me, and then we come up with a plan, which includes how often we want to see each other. Are there things they should do like homework or different projects they should do in between to keep busy, yes, but also to keep working towards whatever the goals they set. As far as a wellness plan, wellness plans can be really simple, or they can be as intricate as you want them to be. One of the last time I made a wellness plan was in August for myself. And what that looked like, I looked at everything that was going on in my life and the things that I wanted to change. It's important when you think about that because goals are different for everybody. Where we go wrong with goals is adding deadlines and dates to them. Because if we don't reach that deadline, then we're upset, but we're upset at ourselves because we didn't reach the deadline. But because they're your goals, you can just erase it and put a new date, or don't use a date at all, or just erase the goal. So a wellness plan for me, just recently, the things I had on it that I wanted to work on was nutrition, exercise, finding a new therapist, and just getting more organized with my job, right? And I wrote those things out. And then I wrote how I would accomplish those things. The other things I pointed out are things I know that triggered my anxiety or my depression, right? We know what they are usually, but we often don't name them, whether you're in a therapy room or not. So with that, I wrote down what my triggers were, and I put something that would combat that. So let's say one of my triggers was lawn care when I'm doing a webinar, right? Okay, if that happens and I'm upset, what will I do? On my desk right now are things I can touch, like fidget spinners to calm me down or center myself. I listen to a lot of podcasts. I like rap music when I'm feeling, triggered by something or I'm feeling anxious. But figuring out what your triggers are first, and then figure out things that bring you joy second, that can bring you back to the moment. All those things I said sound really hard, but the hardest part is just knowing that, you're not alone. These things are happening for a lot of people, and there are ways you can, overcome these things.
So speaking of things that are happening to a lot of people, Sharon brings up a couple of things that can be anxiety-inducing. For her, it's still trying to go out only as possible. She did get her flu shot the other day. Was a little bit concerned about COVID vaccines and all that sort of thing. And I do know that a lot of people are still having a lot of anxiety about, should I get one? Should I get a booster? What's happening with all these things? How is it going to affect my COPD? How is it going to affect all these things? So is that something that you're seeing in your practice a lot too? Some of the vaccine hesitancy or concern or any of that?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And it's completely understand, especially for certain populations, versus other. The best thing you can do is try to learn as much as you can before you make your decision from reputable sources versus Facebook memes, right? And sometimes your reputable source might not be, the grandson that works at a vape shop. And that might not be the person. So do your own research. On a personal note, I was vaccinated in December. I just got my booster. And I was like, give me all the shots. Give them all to me because I want to be able to feel safe enough to see my mom. I couldn't live with the fact that if I had COVID and gave it to her and she died, what will my life be like after that? But that's my reason. Doesn't have to be everybody else's. So as long as you are making an informed decision, making the decision that's best for you, that's fine. But also the things that happen, the indirect things that happen. So let's say you choose not to get vaccinated, but everybody else did, and they are scared to have you around. That's one thing. Doesn't mean you should run out and get a vaccine if you don't feel comfortable with it, but just know that, you know, that those are the impacts of it. Maybe you decided to get a vaccine, but all your friends are anti-vaxxers. And so now you're being, you know, pushed out of the friend group because they found out you got vaccinated. I see that a lot with older folks too. They have this core group of friends, and a lot of times most of their ideologies are the same until this came up. A person with lung disease, completely understandable why you would be worried about a vaccine. However, similar to flu and pneumonia, is decreasing the chances, because if you do get COVID, I'm 100% sure that you will also have a COPD exacerbation because it's a respiratory virus, right? And so you avoided pneumonia and flu, not because you'll need pneumonia and flu, because it's also going to exacerbate your COPD, right? And so it's all about chances and risk. You know, so I understand, you know, how it's hard and how a lot of folks are hesitant, but keep all of the things in mind, both indirect and not indirect and direct outcomes, you know, of making those decisions. You want to add anything about that, Mike?
I think everything you said was fair. I mean, I'm the same kind of person that I was like, give me all the shots as soon as I can. I'll take 4 of them. I mean, you know, I keep taking them. I've still been wearing a mask in a lot of situations. I will say that I'm not 100% unmasking these days, but I still, when I go to stores and things like that, I'm generally wearing a mask because, again, I want to keep myself safe and I want to keep others safe, because I don't know, you know, I may be an asymptomatic carrier. I may have COVID and not know it. And I don't want to spread this to somebody, just like you were saying.
Yeah.
So
I would also, to add to that, let me add one more thing to that, Mike. I want to just speak for a second about masking. Continue to mask. You know, it's really possible, especially for folks, you know, living with lung disease, that afterwards you'll continue to mask as well when we think the pandemic has went away. But look at all the other things that's cool about masking. I don't know if cool is the right word. For instance, when I'm on a plane, I'll probably never not wear a mask again. I can fall asleep with my mouth open. Nobody will know. Like, those are things that you get from masking. I'm very expressive with my face. So if something is disgusting, I have a mask on. How will the person know that I'm disgusted by what you just said or any smell? So you get other perks from that. But also, I haven't had a cold in almost 2 years.
Yeah.
I haven't had a cold in 2 years. I've never felt healthier since I've been wearing a mask.
And honestly, again, when I was in primary care, people would come in and say, hey, in the wintertime, I start coughing a lot whenever I go outside. And it's like, well, you know, that's pretty common. Maybe put a scarf on or something. You know, I was telling people to use face coverings before it was cool. But that really is a thing. You know, cold air can really cause that bronchospasm and that coughing fit and all that sort of thing. But if you're able to have something in front of your face that's kind of warming the air a little bit more before it gets in there, you're going to be more comfortable anyway. I was wearing a scarf over my face. So, you know, I get that there's still a lot of nervousness and people just want to be rid of the masks. And, you know, of course, there are the folks who really do have difficulty with that. But I would wholeheartedly agree, personally speaking, we got to do everything we can to keep each other safe and keep ourselves safe. So switching gears just a little bit, and again, we've got a few more minutes before the top of the hour. So if anybody has any last minute questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat, and we'll get those addressed as best we can. I'm curious to know, as a counselor, what's something that people might not expect to be a stressor in the setting of chronic breathing problems or similar to that? What's something that even the general public might not know is anxiety provoking, depression provoking, just something unexpected.
Yeah, loss of independence. That's a really big one, and that I both see in session, but also when I worked at the hospital. Um, Folks living with lung disease are really focused on quality of life more than quantity, right? However, that doesn't mean that's what their caregivers are focused on, or their family members or relatives or whatever their support system looks like. So oftentimes, if it's a person living with lung disease and they have children, adult children specifically, you get a lot of like, you're so strong and you can do this, but it's okay for them not to be strong as well. If you are a person living with lung disease, you don't have to feel strong all the time. There's nothing wrong with taking a break and just focusing on you. Is the independent piece comes from people try to take that away. You know, you're in your right mind and you feel sad or you're upset. You can be. It's okay. We don't need to pathologize that. As people that are supporting people with lung disease, we need to be okay with that too. It's not up to that person to give away their independence for the sake of somebody else's opinions or somebody else's feelings. Oftentimes in the hospital, I'm just gonna hopefully I'll go on a soapbox about devices, right? We decide what the person is going to take at home without input from them, right? And I've heard physicians say that I'm like they can't use this device. Oh, their family can help them, but they don't have a family. So now what to do? If they did have a family, maybe they want to do it themselves. You know, when folks have to ask for help, that's also them losing independence. You know, and so during a time of COVID and isolation, when more things are being delivered that folks maybe normally go out and get, when people are attempting to do pulmonary rehab at home but can't manage the technology, so they give up. That's all part of independence loss, and that can impact people in a negative way. Loss of independence is the number one thing I see. Loss of choice, loss of control. Um, those are triggers we don't know about. However, the number one trigger is always caregivers and family, like constantly having to be surrounded or think about their, feelings first, can be triggers because you don't know what to do about that. You don't want to hurt their feelings, but you also want them to leave you alone for a minute. You need them to be around for certain things, but you don't need them to try to control every aspect of your life. How do you speak up to your daughter who cares about you that you need a break from her? Right? How do you tell your husband, please leave me alone? Like, we don't have to watch TV together tonight. Those things are hard and can be triggers. And sometimes will drive a wedge in that relationship because folks don't feel safe enough to say it out loud.
It's interesting. We've got two things that I want to hit on that. First, Ina or Enna, I apologize, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce that, mentions that their biggest coping problem is that it is very hard to admit that they can't do everything, just like you were saying. And this is somebody with actually pulmonary fibrosis, so welcome. But I think those are great points, and they tie in well with on our COPD specific social network, COPD 360 Social, which is on our website at copdfoundation.org. We have a weekly check-in by another RT named Jane Martin. And this week, part of her check-in was actually talking to family about some of these things and finding things like, well, if family really wants you to be involved in stuff and you're running low on gas, maybe find something you can do while sitting down, like you can wrap presents while sitting down or slice vegetables or whatever it is that's still helping you be involved, but is at a level where you can manage that. And I tend to find personally that a lot of those middle way kind of things where you can trying not even necessarily to find the win-win, but the compromise that everybody can live with can be really important in these kind of situations. And I think you're right that sometimes it is really difficult to navigate when you haven't had to have these kind of conversations before.
These are the exact, thank you for sharing that, Ina. These are the exact conversations we're having right now with my mom because she's blind, but she wasn't born blind. So she's lost her vision over time with it significantly going away here recently from retinopathy of prematurity, actually. And that's what she was like, I'm just feel down because I can't do the things I used to do no more. And so I'm like, well, let's talk about the things you can do. Like, what can you do? And so, I spoke before, my mom just moved like 4 doors down, to a new townhouse. And my wife and I went over, we're helping, we're putting things together. And, we're all moving around her fast. She can't participate in a lot of things because she just can't. And my wife, she found something that she could do, and she had her do something as simple as, to us, it looks like a simple thing, right? And she threaded the shower curtain and the shower liner on those hooks. I personally hate that. I don't want to do that. But it took her a minute, but she did it. She found a way to participate. She was like, I still have lots of other things I can do. The thing that Ina brought up, though, is a part of the stages of grief, because it's not just loss. We're grieving change, too. And acceptance is the hardest one to do. Acceptance is the final stage. So when we've had this full life and something changes that is drastic, we assuming that the life is over. Well, it's really not. You just got a new life. It's a different life. And accepting what that new life is difficult. But we have to highlight the things we can do. Ina is a phenomenal nurse, if that's the person I think it is talking, and worked in critical care for years. And so I know that change is difficult, but you can absolutely be successful at it. I'm happy to chat after this too, Ina.
So as we're getting up to the top of the hour, a couple last things I want to throw out there. Joe says, Gabby may have an MPH and an MA, but I'm listening to a PhD, real talk. So, and Louise mentions, and something that I certainly wholeheartedly agree with, there should be more information out there about palliative care. So do you have some thoughts really on palliation?
Yes. Well, I think everybody should be on palliative care. I think palliative care is everybody should have it. I think it's a basic. Everybody wants to experience as much comfort throughout life as they can.
Let me interrupt you for just a second, because I think also a lot of people are confused sometimes between palliative care and hospice care. So if you could just clarify for us for a moment what the difference is between the two.
Well, comfort should be involved in all care. So palliative care does involve comfort too. And so I think that word can be triggering for a lot of people when you hear comfort, like, oh, it's comfort before death, right? Palliative care is because first of all, you want to be included in the decisions that are being made, but it has nothing to do with death per se. There are tons of definitions. I don't want to give a specific definition because Google has lots of them, and I want people to be discouraged. But palliative care is a good thing for folks to experience it. Shauna Strickland talks a lot about palliative care and how it's something that everybody should have when they come to the hospital, even if they're coming for a broken fingernail, right? But you're right. Palliative care should be available. People should talk more about it. There are experts out there. There are physicians that just focus on this, and mental health professionals that just focus on the importance around that. But definitely know that palliative care can be a positive experience. It's not always associated with death or terminal illness. I would also say, just to add to that, COPD is a livable disease. So if you get that diagnosis, or if you got that diagnosis, it does not mean death is coming for you immediately, right? It means that the C also means change is coming. Like, there are some things that might have to be changed for you to live how you want to live. So don't give up.
Yeah, a good friend of mine and patient advocate, John Linnell, says two things. He says, first off, take off your shoes, take off your socks, see if you can find an expiration date, because you don't know.
Yeah.
And he also says that it's his goal to die with COPD, not from COPD. And I think that's very admirable myself. So, and also says, thank you, Gabby. See, you totally get it. And Sharon shares one last story about, again, feeling loss of independence and validating all that stuff that's out there, not being able to chase around with the kids for Halloween upcoming this weekend and all that sort of thing. But finding ways to be involved, passing out candy, being able to sit down doing that, making trick or treat bags, all
Hmm.
that sort of thing. Just finding ways to adapt to that change and to make it work for you. So I think
There is
that's a
space for
oh
everybody to participate. I'm sorry, Mike.
no.
There is space for. I know we're going to go over time. There's space for everybody to participate in everything. We just have to find out what's the best form of participation, and we don't have to do what everybody else is doing right now. That looks like, if let's say you can't go out and trick or treat with the kids, you can help make costumes, or you know you could be the neighbor that everybody brings the costumes to, and you just help the kids get dressed. There are different things. You can sit outside with a mask on or a witch's hat. There are things that you can do, but like Sharon said, you find other ways. Find a third way. There's always a third way.
And Tina agrees absolutely. 12 years later, still trying to accept the things I cannot do. Many stages of living and coping with COPD can be the hardest when you were diagnosed, when you first diagnosed, and having that change and kind of grieving the previousness of things. So with that, I thank you sincerely for spending an hour with us today. I think this has been a remarkable conversation. I think it's going to be very valuable for a lot of folks. I'm hopeful that a lot of people who were able to attend live today got a lot out of it. I'm hopeful that people who may be viewing us later on YouTube or on Facebook stimulate some good conversation. I hope you're able to get a lot out of it too. We're going to switch to a end card in a moment here. It's going to have some of Gabby's contact information, and I'm sure she'll be willing to drop her website in the comments here too. And of course, we can get that information out there as well. And we invite everybody who is having trouble coping or anything like that to take advantage of our resources with the foundation, or find the resources that work the best for you, because there really is no one-size-fits-all solution. So that's my perspective. I'm Mike Hess from the COPD Foundation. I want to give Gabby, as the subject matter expert here, I want to give her the last word, and then we'll say goodbye.
Just thank you for having me, Mike. For the folks that tuned in, thank you for listening, and for the folks that'll listen later, thank you too. Just don't forget, there's space for everybody, and don't give up.
All right. Thanks, everybody.